So, it's been 1 year since the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation against Ukraine, with the goal of demilitarizing, denazifying, and politically neutralizing the country. This special military operation took the entire world by surprise. Literally no one saw this coming. Well, barring a few exceptions, for example, the US State Department, and imagine not believing those guys, am I right? 1 year on, it seems a lot of expectations have been defied. Having come into the war expecting a swift takeover of Kyiv and the removal of the Ukrainian government, Putin's military operation has turned out to be far more special than we might have anticipated. Got him! Despite the Kremlin's ambitions, Ukraine has reclaimed over half the land that was captured by Russia since last year. Even the prospect of taking back Crimea, which last year might have seemed like a pipe dream, is now no longer off the table. After ignoring Zelensky's offer to rule out NATO membership in the beginning of March, Russian aggression has now made the alliance more popular than ever. By the end of the year, support for NATO membership amongst Ukrainians reached an all-time high of 83%, and it's very likely that Sweden and Finland will also be joining in the near future. As for denazification, which, let's face it, was never a good faith objective in the first place, this goal has, if anything, been set back by the presence of neo-Nazi Russian militants in the country, doing quite a lot of Nazi-esque shit. Now, this war has been somewhat unprecedented given how much of the coverage has been gathered from independent social media. A Russian regiment has been accused of crimes against humanity in the city of Bucha, and an overwhelming amount of the evidence against them was gathered from iPhone recordings taken by civilians and, more damningly, from the social media activity of the perpetrators themselves. Of course, the downside of this relatively new phenomenon is that we now have to deal with an onslaught of unqualified dipshits spewing their 2 cents with no accountability besides that of a bunch of equally unqualified wallopers in the comment section. As the average social media user might say, the first casualty of war is the truth. Before then following up with the most criminally insane take you've ever seen on Facebook.com. Now, there are a few things I wanted to do to mark the 1 year anniversary of the war. I have a couple of more serious videos that might take a little longer to finish, so in the meantime, I thought we could have a recap of some of the worst takes on the Russia-Ukraine war. So, let's begin with number 5, Hasan Piker. So, just as a disclaimer, we don't dislike Hasan on this channel, but we have had a few issues with his takes on Ukraine. His obscene level of confidence that fears of a Russian invasion were overblown.
Yeah, I would look like Tim Pool after that 49-state landslide L if, there was a active bombing currently happening on Kiev.
His sketchy parroting of a Russian conspiracy theory about snipers and a woman named Olga.
Intercepted phone calls that literally show that the right sector, which, and the CIA involved, CIA-trained right-wing operatives in Ukraine could have perhaps engaged in such a violent action. Okay.
His bizarre colonialist justifications for the annexation of Crimea, and his assertion that Russia had a stronger claim to Crimea because they brutally displaced the Tatar population in 1944. And a whole bunch of other times before that.
Number one group of individuals that Crimea belongs to is the Tatars. The number 2 individuals that Crimea belongs to by way of the Crimean Khanate is the Turks. The number 3 group of individuals that Crimea belongs to is the Russians, because they purged the Tatars and now more Russians live there. Okay. Maybe number 4, Greece. Fuck it. Give it to Greece instead. And then number 5 on there is Ukraine. Okay. Number 5 is Ukraine. This idea that you have any sort of sovereignty and any sort of constitutional sovereignty that needs to be held together. Crimea belongs to Mongolia before it belongs to Ukraine. So Ukraine number 6 in that situation. Okay?
Now, I know Hasan has already admitted he was wrong about predicting the invasion. I'm not sure if he still holds the same view on Crimea, but if he does, and if he ever watches this, I think a good question to ask would be, is this not exactly the same logic that's used by the State of Israel and a certain ex-US president when they argue for annexing the Jewish majority parts of the West Bank. Because if Crimea is ever recognized as part of Russia, that does basically set the precedent that future colonial expansion is acceptable in places where it happened in the past. And I would say that's not good. Okay, is that the good faith criticism out of the way? Yeah. Alright, next. 4. Jordan Peterson. In the summer of last year, Dr. Gorbis Jeeperson uploaded a 51-minute monologue entitled Russia versus Ukraine or Civil War in the West? ? Now, I don't even know if there's a fair way to describe exactly what's happening here. The names of the timestamps don't really give any clues, although the subheading in the description does seem to imply that the Russian fire was fueled by a culture war in the West. So, would it be very bad faith of me if I just assumed he spends most of this video complaining about Idpol culture war issues and somehow trying to connect that to Russian aggression in Ukraine, but that is kind of what he does. And I say kind of because this entire script might as well have been produced by an AI bot. For example, here are some of the most replayed sections.
And the advantage of her minority status is a genuine and defensible mark in her favor, given the historical context. Now, I take the people who told me this seriously, and I backed off. I still think it was utterly foolish and pandering of the worst and most unforgivable sort to announce the necessity of a black woman first. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky asks, "Is everything permitted now that God is dead?" In The Devils, also known as The Possessed, he asks, "What forms might belief take, and to what end, when the strictures of traditional belief are burst asunder? What dread demons might take the place of the displaced Yahweh?" It is not only the Russians who object to the nightmare of compassionate authoritarianism that increasingly possesses the West. All the Eastern European countries whose populations groaned under the Stalinist burden are watching the resurgence of these demented ideas among their erstwhile enlightened allies with stunned disbelief. Romanians, Estonians, Hungarians, Albanians, all those countries kowtow to the resentful, faux moralistic, opportunistic, anarchic narcissists of the radical left.
Okay, I'm sorry. Is he aware that most of the countries he's talking about have willingly opted to lean towards Europe rather than Russia? Did he really say Russia was the one rejecting authoritarianism? But buried in this pseudo-intellectual word salad, he left us with a piece of gold.
And all protestations to the contrary. None of us give a damn about Ukraine, and never have. Remember the Holodomor? Do you even know what it was? Remember the Holodomor?
Now, this would have been very unfair of me if he was just misspeaking, but... well, 2 months later, he did an interview with Lex Friedman, and I can't tell if Lex knew he made the same mistake before. It looks like he's trying to bait him into saying it, but all the same, he did it again.
Let me ask you about the famine of the 30s.
Yeah.
Do you think...
Ukraine?
In the Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Fun.
Similar, a lot of the things you mentioned in the last few sentences kind of echo to that part of human history.
The Holodomor.
Do you...
no one knows about.
Well...
Sorry, I feel like if you're going to smugly talk about how everyone else is ignorant about the history, you should probably get the fucking name right. Like, you can't just say, "Oh, do you even know what happened in Ukraine? Do you even know about the Hullabaloo-mador?" 3. Roger Waters. Okay, hey, I love Pink Floyd, but even as a teenage simp, I always thought it wasn't hard to spot the apocalyptically pretentious git behind the music. And on September 5th, 2022, Waters published an open letter on his website addressed to the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska, where he quoted his own lyrics to her, insisted that his heart bleeds for her and all the Ukrainian and Russian families devastated by the war, and then followed up with, BBC.com quotes you as saying that if support for Ukraine is strong, the crisis will be shorter. I guess that might depend on what you mean by support for Ukraine. If by support for Ukraine you mean the West continuing to supply arms to the Kiev government's armies, I fear you may be tragically mistaken. Throwing fuel in the form of armaments into a firefight has never worked to shorten a war in the past, and it won't work now. What the fuck? And after pretending that Lend-Lease was never a thing during the Second World War, Waters proposed that Zelenska, tells her husband, I guess, to implement his election promises and 1. End the civil war in the east and bring peace to the Donbass and partial autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk, and 2. To ratify and implement the rest of the body of the Minsk II agreements. So there are a few problems with making these demands today, especially now that there have been a few developments since Zelensky's election in 2019, namely the big invasion, special military operation that's been happening for the last year. I wonder how feasible Waters thinks partial autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk is now, given that so much of the civilian population has fled the region, and now that in the same month that Waters wrote this letter, Russia annexed both of these territories, as well as Kherson and Zaporizhia. Regarding the Minsk Accords, which were signed in 2015 as an attempt to end the civil war in eastern Ukraine, well, it's true that the agreement wasn't upheld by either side. Although it might be hard to expect Ukraine to uphold their end, given that one key point of the deal was the withdrawal of foreign armed formations, military equipment, and mercenaries, something which the Russians never followed through on. In fact, Putin didn't even admit that there were Russian troops in the Donbass until over a year later. And it's not exactly like he's known for upholding peace agreements. The Budapest Memorandum in 1994 was an agreement to respect the borders and sovereignty of 3 ex-Soviet countries in exchange for them giving up their nuclear weapons. And Russia has been violating that agreement with regards to Ukraine since 2014. So maybe Roger should have written a letter to Putin instead. He did. Okay, well, let's see what we have here. Would you like to see an end to this war? If you were to reply and say, yes, please, that would immediately make things a lot easier. If you were to come out and say, also, the Russian Federation has no further territorial interests beyond the security of the Russian-speaking populations of the Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, that would help too. I should say, the fact that he wrote this at the same time that Russia was planning to annex 2 of these territories plus the other 2 in the southeast is f***ing insane. Anyway, let's carry on. I say this because I know some people who think you want to overrun the whole of Europe, starting with Poland and the rest of the Baltic states. If you do, fuck you. And we might as well all stop playing the desperately dangerous game of nuclear chicken that the hawks on both sides of the Atlantic seem too comfortable with, and have at it. Yup, just blow each other and the world to smithereens. The problem is, I have kids and grandkids, and so do most of my brothers and sisters all over the world, and none of us would relish that outcome. So please, Mr. Putin, indulge me and make us that assurance. All right, back to the table. Fucking... Bro, shut the fuck up. 2. Jackson Hinkle. Jackson Hinkle, seen here looking like a Fox News host but done in Lego, is, Okay, where do you start with this guy? Well, in his own words, he is the most censored man on YouTube. But despite being so censored, he did manage to bag a Serena Sheem Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism, which was given to him by a pro-Assad lobby group. Just ignore that last part. He is a full-blown supporter of the Putin regime and of the Russian invasion. Why? Well, mostly because he's a bloodless, propagandistic shell of a man, but maybe also because he was a parrot of the very well-known Kremlin talking point, which claimed that Ukraine was committing a genocide against ethnic Russian civilians in the east. A month after the war started, Gibson Hinkle claimed that the Russian military operation was in fact a defensive war because Ukraine had been slaughtering thousands of ethnic Russians in the Donbass and was on the verge of launching a full-scale invasion. Wait, an invasion of who? Russia or their own territory? Okay. Of course, this wasn't so much a genocide as it was a civil war that was waged after Russia had sent their own fighters into the region, which again, Putin admitted to. It is, however, true that there were about 14,000 deaths, including military and civilians on both sides, but if it was the deaths of Russians that led to the invasion, it does make you wonder why Putin waited until the conflict was effectively frozen before invading. Between 2016 and 2022, the average number of civilian deaths per year in Ukraine was around 60, and this included killings perpetrated by both Ukrainians and Russians. And if Giblet Shingles really was bothered about civilian casualties, I can't imagine why he'd think invading was a good idea, since the number of deaths last year far exceeded that of the preceding 8 years in the Donbass. And given that most of the fighting has been in eastern Ukraine, that would also mean that a huge portion of those civilians killed by the Russian army will have incidentally been ethnic Russians. Which is not a good look for the person who is apparently so concerned about the slaughter of ethnic Russian civilians. Jorben Finkel. Which brings us to 1. Haz. Now, where do we start with Haz? Haz, aka Infrared, aka the Moscow Menace, is a MAGA communist, never mind, known for his passionate outbursts.
Bitching out! 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 Bitching out!
His revolutionary debate tactics.
You do realize
You didn't
that I'm
demonstrate
just
you want me to
going
answer that question.
I'm going to keep asking.
You didn't demonstrate
questions.
what you're gonna keep doing it.
Are you trying to make me?
You didn't
angry or
demonstrate I'm
something?
trying.
Because it's not working.
You didn't demonstrate it's not working.
Okay, you haven't demonstrated anything.
You haven't demonstrated I
how do you
haven't demonstrated anything.
And his extremely dubious assertions about the war in Ukraine. Take, for example, the Ukrainian biolabs theory. Now, this story, if you don't remember it, is a very good example of how there can be different interpretations of an issue that vary depending on how zany you're feeling. The truthful version of the story is unfortunately the most boring one. That in Ukraine there are a bunch of mostly ex-Soviet biolabs working with dangerous pathogens, where the Ukrainians have been openly carrying out cooperative research with the United States since 2005. The Kremlin version of this story is that the research being carried out in these labs, for example this publicly accessible study on ectoparasites of bats, is actually an alarming security concern that might be related to terrorism. Something which is yet to be proven 1 year into the war, but we'll come back to that. And the Haz version of the story is, well,
The Ukrainian government was literally hosting US bioterrorism and US biological warfare laboratories on its fucking soil. And you're telling me that the Ukrainian government was not anti-Russian? Pepe Escobar would probably come on your show. You're telling me they're not anti-Russian? They're connecting Russian DNA on Ukrainian soil for developing bioweapons, and the Ukrainian government was hosting this. The Ukrainian government hated Russians so fucking much that they were developing biological weapons that would specifically target Russian DNA.
now it's difficult to stay too angry at Haz in particular. He was one of several streamers who was banned from Twitch for spreading Russian propaganda, and his career does seem to have been fairly stagnant ever since. But it does point to something a bit more sinister about the Russian media machine. It's questionable whether Kremlin propaganda is really even supposed to convince anyone. Most of the time it looks like they're barely even trying. I mean, what the f is this? This is footage of the Bucha massacre that just has the word fake written across it. Is anyone really falling for this? Well, maybe, but that isn't necessarily the point. One of the theories of Russian media is that they operate around a kind of postmodernist relativism. The perspective they want people to hold is that all media outlets lie. All of it is bullshit, and because of that, there is no absolute truth. We have our reality, and they have theirs.
Everything is relative, and we in Russia, we could use postmodernity in order to explain to the West that if any truth is relative, so we have our special Russian truth that you need to accept as something that maybe is not your truth.
Even if it's not true.
But if the truth is relative.
So the point of media material like this is not so much to change minds, but to sow doubt. And anything Russia is accused of doing, they can accuse someone else of doing the same thing. If they can't have a monopoly on truth and power, neither can anyone else.
If you affirm that the West says the truth and Russia says lie, I would respond, Russia says truth, that this truth is absolute truth, and the West says lie.
Okay, so we're playing a chess game. If I say to you, Western journalists are often biased and mistaken, but they try to tell the truth, whereas Russian TV has gone through the other side.
No. And if you say that,
and they're not even trying to tell the truth.
If you say that Western TV is sometimes biased, sometimes not, I would say Russian TV is sometimes biased, sometimes not. If you say we are sometimes not biased, but you are always biased, I would say exactly, you are sometimes biased, we are sometimes
so we're always
not biased.
Exactly equal.
Absolutely, and that is multipolarity.
Right.
Of course, what's incredibly sad is that Russian figureheads can be strangely transparent about this, but there is somehow no shortage of people who are willing to eat it up anyway. This story about the biolabs was brought up fairly early in the war. Now that the Russian army has been in Ukraine for a year and no biochemical attacks have taken place, that story about the labs seems to have fallen off the face of the earth. And it was always going to, because it was obviously bullshit. But I don't think people should forget just how many people bought into it. Glenn Greenwald pushed this story. Russell Brand pushed it. Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, Michael Knowles, Tim Pool all pushed it. Ben Shapiro apparently refuted it. GigaChad. Of course, there won't be any retractions from any of these wankers. They'll jump onto the next collection of batshit conspiracy theories and quietly move on when it turns out they don't have a leg to stand on. But if you can remind people about it every now and then, surely that doesn't hurt. If you like this video, you can, what can you do? You can support me on Patreon, you can become a YouTube member and get access to some of these custom emojis that you can use in the comment section. What else? You can send me a one-off donation on PayPal if you want. Yeah, do one of those things. Or do more than one of them. Oh, hey. Nailed it.